Welcome to 10-Minute Record Reviews, episode 266. And this time I'm going to talk about the Beatles' second record, released in 1963 on Parlophone, the EMI subsidiary in the UK. And this is a mono pressing. There's a lot of debate, frankly, way too much debate, about what the official first pressing of this actually is, which you can delve into Discogs if you're interested. This is not an official first pressing, but it is released on or around November 22nd, 1963, the official release date. What's important to remember about this record is that the 7 months that elapses between the 22nd of March 1963, when Please Please Me comes out, and the 22nd of November, when this record comes out, bridges the gap between the Beatles being pretty well known in England and world famous. At the start of this period, they're still hustling to solidify their standing as a top group in Britain. They've got a great record out, but Beatlemania has not taken off. They're still playing small towns across rural England, northern towns. It's a long way to the top if you want to rock and roll, but their incredible work ethic, their remarkable radio performances, which were spreading news about them all over the country, and the sheer quality of the music they were putting out meant that the dam had to break in 1963, and break it did. This record repeats the formula of the debut record almost song for song, but the improvement in sound and polish is noticeable. Even if the originals aren't necessarily at the same level as the originals in the first record, the overall feel is of a band really hitting its stride, with their label behind them helping them to sound as good as we all know they could sound. 1963 is the annus mirabilis for the Beatles, the year when everything changes and they basically leave the surface of the earth. If you count concerts, other performances like appearances on TV and radio, and recording sessions, the Beatles are basically performing one way or another more than 200 times in the 7 months between the release of the prior record and this one, which is basically about a gig every day. They're also churning out singles, most of which did not actually appear on UK LPs. The other truly amazing and quite intense thing they did much of the way through 1963 was a whole series of appearances on BBC Radio. Now, they'd started this in 1962, they kept going into 64 and 65, but the bulk of those happened in 1963. Some of these, of course, have seen official release, but there's actually apparently about 10 CDs worth of these performances. If you're interested, I would recommend checking out Purple Chick, which is the label to put this stuff out. You can also find a lot of this stuff on YouTube, and I'll put some links down in the description below. These performances, maybe as much as anything other than the music itself, do a lot to explain why the Beatles became so famous in England in 1963. They relied on things which the Beatles had in spades, of course: charm, wit, chemistry. They're routinely hilarious, they're totally unscripted, and you hear the Beatles covering all kinds of stuff that people just phone up and ask for, and they just knock off a version which is often way better than the original. Anybody who thinks the Beatles were in any way overrated needs to do a deep dive into some of those radio appearances. However, if there's a specific day in 1963 when the Beatlemania plane takes off, it's October 13th, when they appear on ITV's program Sunday Night at the London Palladium, which was basically the Ed Sullivan show of its day in the UK. It was the most widely watched musical variety show. And from then on in, the press coverage is wall-to-wall, relentless, silly in many cases. They then go and do some Swedish gigs, and when they get back, things are completely off the chain. They're mobbed at the airport. There's more than 100 reporters there, let alone screaming fans at the airport. The police start to have to use riot control tactics in various places, and the Beatles at this point have become something which transcended anything that they themselves actually were. They had become something that was right for the time in which they existed. And this particular moment in the fall of 1963 is encapsulated in Lennon's remarks at the Royal Command performance about people in the cheap seats clapping their hands and the rest of you rattle your jewelry. Unthinkable for a British person, live on the BBC, to basically mock the English aristocracy directly to their faces up until that particular point, and suddenly it's possible. Why? Because here is somebody who is a pop culture icon who is now apparently beyond the control of the elite, beyond the ability of the elite to restrain his behavior and make him fit into the social class boxes which English people inhabited. Now, I don't want to overstate the influence of that particular moment, but in general, it's difficult to overstate the extent to which, particularly artistic classes in the UK, felt a sense of liberation because of what the Beatles were able to do and the way that they saw them shaking off the shackles of class. And from that point on, the 1960s in Britain were a whole different thing. As I mentioned, with the Beatles' new status, EMI gave them far more time to make this record than they'd given them to make the first one. 7 different recording sessions between July and October 1963, of course at Abbey Road, and of course with George Martin producing. There are a lot of songs here with 10 or more takes. There's a song from George. Overall, there's just generally a more polished sound. It's the same formula as the debut. There are 8 originals and 6 covers. If anything, the originals, I would say, are a little weaker than on the debut. From the covers, but also some of the originals, you can tell the band are really very much in the thrall of Motown still, and very much in the thrall of some of the awesome girl groups of the day. As such, you could argue they haven't really yet found their voice, but for a lot of people, including me, this record is even more rewarding than the debut. In particular, all 6 of those covers are remarkable in their own way. Despite the derivative nature of the material, you can feel the band beginning to assert themselves and take control. The cover is Artie. The first one was kind of a knockoff, but this is clearly an Artie cover. There were a number of different inspirations for this. Astrid Kirchherr, who is the German photographer who took so many of those great early Beatles photos from Hamburg. She'd been the partner of Stu Sutcliffe, who'd been with the band for a while and had died the previous April, had taken a number of photos of John and George in Stu's attic loft, in his art loft, in kind of a half-light way. For his part, Brian Epstein was much taken with the work of a photographer called Robert Freeman, who had taken some black and white photos of Coltrane, which Epstein had seen. Freeman shows up. The Beatles had a extended stay in Bournemouth in the summer of 1963 at the Palace Court Hotel, and it's in a corridor there that he takes his photograph. Lots of hassle about the picture. EMI wanted them smiling. Of course, they're not smiling. The Beatles also wanted to have just his photograph, no name of the Beatles, no other text on the cover. EMI nixed that. It's released on the 22nd of November 1963. 3 months later, the Beatles are on Ed Sullivan, helping Americans get over the shock of the Kennedy assassination, and things would never really be the same. Side one starts with a real rocker written by John, It Won't Be Long, which has got this great descending lick by George. And you can hear, I think, quite clearly the Motown influence and all the call and answer stuff that happens at various points in this song. That's followed by another John song, All I've Got to Do, which is more than just another example of John's girl group obsession. It's actually an incredible example of how the Beatles could actually write music like that in ways which, frankly, Berry Gordy could have put out in Detroit and made millions. Then we have Paul's All My Loving, which is a real signature tune for him, despite, amazingly enough, not having been a single in the UK. Next is Don't Bother Me, which of course is George's songwriting debut. He'd then be put on the shelf for a couple of years. This has got a great contrast of George basically bringing the gloom in the verses and John playing this really cool shimmering guitar. Little Child, and I'll say this because the Beatles say it themselves, basically filler. I mean, it's Beatles filler, so it's high quality, but still filler. And then we have that oddity Till There Was You, which is actually a Broadway tune, very clearly Paul's first serious foray into so-called granny music, as John called it. The best is left for last on side one, with the cover of the Marvelettes' Please Mr. Postman, John's vocal right up there with his vocal on Twist and Shout, arguably significantly better than the original. Side two begins with George singing Roll Over Beethoven. This, of course, had been a band favorite for years and years and years. They played it in the clubs. Then a bit of a lowlight, Hold Me Tight, another filler track with probably Paul's worst middle eight of his entire career. We then get another Motown cover, You Really Get a Hold on Me by Smokey Robinson and the Miracles. This one is edited together from a whole bunch of different takes. I personally think it lacks a little bit of energy. I think it's reasonable for the Beatles to have lacked energy at various points in 1963. I think it comes across here. I Want to Be Your Man, which again is filler, but high quality filler. This is the one they gave to the Stones and they let Ringo sing it. Devil in Her Heart is a cover of a B-side of a relatively obscure single by an obscure R&B band that didn't last very long, the Donays. The second last song on the record is Not a Second Time, written by John. This is the track which inspired a whole bout of pretty pretentious musical criticism in the pages of the Times about E minor chords and Aeolian cadences and so on. Anyway, I'll let you look that up. Then a final Motown cover, Money. A lot of people love this song. Personally, I almost find the riff sounds almost out of tune, or certainly pretty discordant, and I also think that John sounds like he's spitting flecks of foam when he's singing, but if not by me, beloved by many. It goes without saying that Beatles records are worth buying regardless of what I say, but what I would encourage with respect to this record is paying attention to not just the quality of the Motown covers and the R&B covers, but the ability of the Beatles by this point to actually write songs, as I mentioned, which could easily have been Motown hits in their own right. Looking back, I gave their debut 4.5 stars, which I now think was a little generous. This is a better record, but it's not perfect, so I guess I have to give it 4.5 stars too. Once you're done wallowing in all their super artistic and fantastic later stuff, go back and immerse yourself in the early records, and this is a great one to start with.